On June 17th, the executive board of the IMF met and completed the review of our 11th and 12th quarterly performance. That review was positive, and so they released approximately $80 million to Jamaica. That brings the IMF loans to Jamaica under this program to $748.2 million. So it really adds up, and it's going to be somewhere in the region of $1 billion by the end of the program. So the NIR is fairly comfortably ahead of the IMF target. The primary surplus at May, and remember, in between quarters there are no IMF targets, so we're really measuring this now against the Government of Jamaica budget. At May, the primary surplus was $17.5 billion against a target of $8 billion. So very large outperformance, $9.5 billion on the primary surplus. So let's look a little bit more in depth at what caused that primary surplus to be so big. Well, revenues and taxes performed quite well, just like they did last month and did in the last quarter of last year. It looks to me like the tax administration really is getting on top of this issue of tax collection. Certainly they are performing much closer to budget and beating budget pretty regularly now. 67.6 billion was collected against a target of 63.8. So they outperformed by $3.9 billion. When you compare the 67.6 to last year, same time, they collected about 60 billion. So they were about 12 billion ahead of last year. Of course, remember, there are special taxes in this year that weren't there last year. The SET on gasoline and whatever else it was put on. Plus there's inflation. But the 12 billion is quite a good performance over last year. All categories of the taxes more or less performed positively, and that's a good sign. It's not like one tax is doing it and the others are lagging. Generally they are all performing to budget. Of course, in July we're going to see the first impact of the new personal income tax threshold. So we're going to see the PAYE numbers slow down a bit in July. In fact, quite a bit. Somewhere maybe in the region of about $1 billion a month. It will slow down by. So we'll watch that in our coming reviews. So not only did the revenues and grants perform beyond budget, but the expenditure was below budget. And that is primarily, of course, because there was no approved budget for most of April and May, all of April and most of May. The budget was finally approved pretty late in May. And so release of expenditure was very conservative. People were very prudent about how they released expenditure. As a result, the programs were underspent by $3.3 billion, the capital budget underspent by $3.2 billion, and the interest payments were $1.5 billion less than budget. All of this contributed to the primary surplus overperformance and to the fiscal balance, which turned out to be negative 0.4 billion. Compared to a budgeted negative 15.1 billion. So the fiscal balance is almost in balance compared to the budgeted minus 15.1. Just to say, as we said last time, as the year progresses, now the budget has been approved, the expenditure is going to pick up and start to match up more closely with the budgeted numbers. The personal income tax trips in July, and you will see the tax performance slow a bit in respect of producing these very large surpluses above budget. So a good start, but don't read the big surpluses read them with some caution. As the year progresses, they are going to even out the budget much more. Looking on some of the economic data that was released in the period, Statin released inflation for May, 0.2%. This is the first month in 5 months that the consumer price index has been positive. Remember the last time we had a briefing, we said it was negative for January, February, March, April. Well, May was positive 0.2%, first month in this calendar year that it has been positive. What drove that? Electricity up 0.6, transport up 0.8. You can interpret that to being oil went up. So once the price of oil rose, you started to see that inflation trickle into electricity, which trickled into water, and transportation also driven by that. Calendar, that is January to May, inflation has been minus 1.4%. Minus 1.4%. Interestingly, and I could say that the trailing 12 month is 2.1%. So let's look at the calendar inflation, minus 1.4. The depreciation in the Jamaican dollar was 4%. So that the gain in competitiveness has been 5.4% in the first 5 months of the year. Right? If you look on a trailing 12 months, inflation is 2.1 and the depreciation in the currency has been 8%. So that the gain in competitiveness over the last 12 months has been 5.9%. So any way you look at it, the Jamaican dollar has become more competitive. The Jamaican dollar, I should say, Jamaican goods and services have become more competitive in the last 12 months and in the last 5 months. Statin also released information on GDP growth for the first quarter of 2016, 0.8%. What's the good news here? That it's positive. That it's still less than 1%. Okay, we kind of tired of that, but it's positive. Indeed, I believe that the calendar GDP growth for 2015 turned out to be 1%. I believe I'm correct with this, and it will be the first time in a while that we have had a calendar GDP growth that is more or equal to 1% or more. So I guess you can interpret this all as improvement, even if it is very incremental. Looking at the GDP sectors to see where the growth occurred, generally it occurred across all of the sectors. In the services sector, it grew by 0.7%, and in the rail sector, 0.9%. And when you dive a little deeper into each of those broad categories, you see that agriculture grew 3%, construction 0.2%, and manufacturing 0.2%. Mining retreated 1.5%. And this has become almost consistent for mining over several quarters now. Electricity was up 5.3%. Hotel and tourism business up 2.4%, and finance up 1.6%. So generally growth throughout except for mining. The Bank of Jamaica also released some information on private sector credit. And remember, we started to focus on this metric a couple briefings ago because it's a good indicator of how active the private sector is in drawing down loans to make investments. And what we're seeing is that credit is growing to the private sector. In real terms, that is taking out inflation. Private sector credit grew by 10% over the last 12 months. This is a pretty good number, and I think that all economists would be quite happy to see that this number has hit double digits. Just a few more remarks. The public sector reform and pension reform set to start up very shortly. I believe the pension reform legislation is to come back to Parliament in the near future. It was almost there, and then we had elections. So I think it will be, it's pretty much ready and will come back very shortly. And the public sector reform is to start in earnest in a couple of months' time. And the public sector reform is an important structural adjustment that we are going to be watching carefully. Let me conclude, and if you don't mind, I just want to read verbatim two short statements from the IMF Executive Board. It said, since May of 2013, that's the start of the IMF program, Jamaica's implementation of the economic reform program has been exceptional by international standards. Now, just to say, the IMF doesn't use superlatives very often. The strongest superlative I've ever heard them use is strong. You know, sometimes the staff says that the performance of Jamaica has been strong. Well, they've gone a step further. They've kicked it up a notch. And they're saying now that the program has been exceptional by international standards. So Bolt has some competition there. Not just him good by international standards. Jamaica is too. It continues. Nonetheless, growth and employment have remained weak, and directors underscore the need to accelerate efforts to address deep-rooted structural impediments to strong private sector-led growth. In this regard, they welcomed the new administration's commitment to reform objectives. So, saying very much what we have been saying, that growth is here, but it is pretty anemic, and we need to do much more to get it stronger, more resilient. Thank you. Take some questions.